The Riverside County Jail wasn't designed for HOA presidents. Karen sat on the narrow bench in her holding cell, still wearing her Willow Creek, Where Standards Matter polo shirt, now decorated with concrete dust and sweat stains. Her one phone call had gone to her husband Dave, who'd responded with a silence so long she thought the line went dead. "I'll call Mitchell," he'd finally said, referring to their lawyer son. "Karen, what were you thinking?" That was 8 hours ago. Now, as fluorescent lights hummed overhead and a woman in the next cell sang off-key gospel songs, Karen was asking herself the same question. The cell door clanged open. "Whitmore, you've got visitors." Dave sat across from her in the visitation room, his face a mixture of exhaustion and embarrassment. Beside him, their son Mitchell looked every inch the successful attorney, except for the stress lines around his eyes that hadn't been there at Christmas. "Mom, they're charging you with vandalism, trespassing, and destruction of property," Mitchell said without preamble. "That's potentially 3 to 5 years." Years. Karen felt the blood drain from her face. But it was an emergency action. The HOA Charter clearly states. "The HOA Charter doesn't override actual law," Mitchell interrupted. "You destroyed property worth $15,000 that didn't belong to you." Dave leaned forward. "The neighborhood's in chaos, Karen. Half the residents are calling for your resignation. The other half think you're some kind of folk hero. Mrs. Patterson started a GoFundMe for your legal defense, and the Johnsons filed a petition to dissolve the entire HOA." Dissolve? Karen's voice cracked. The Willow Creek HOA was her life's work, her legacy. They can't dissolve it. "Do you know what this neighborhood was like Before you what?" Dave's voice carried an edge she'd never heard before. "Before you turned into the neighborhood dictator. Karen, listen to yourself. You destroyed someone's pool with a sledgehammer. Normal people don't do that." The words hit harder than the concrete chunks from her rampage. Karen stared at her hands, noticing for the first time the blisters on her palms, the dirt under her fingernails. When had she become someone who resolved problems with a sledgehammer? "I was protecting our investment," she said quietly. "Our home values, our community standards." "At what cost?" Mitchell pulled out his legal pad. "I can probably get you a P deal. Community service, restitution, maybe probation. But Karen, you need to understand, this isn't just about the legal consequences anymore." A corrections officer appeared at the door. "Time's up." As Dave and Mitchell gathered their things, Karen grabbed her husband's hand. "I can fix this. Once I get out, I can call a community meeting, explain my reasoning." Dave gently pulled his hand away. "Karen, the homeowners voted last night. Emergency session. You've been removed as HOA president." The words echoed in the empty visitation room long after her family had gone. Karen Whitmore, who'd spent 3 years micromanaging every blade of grass and mailbox placement in Willow Creek, was no longer in control of anything, not even her own freedom. Back in her cell, as the gospel singer launched into another hymn, Karen closed her eyes and tried to remember when protecting her community had become more important than actually living in it. The sledgehammer came down with a satisfying crack, sending chunks of concrete flying across the Hendersons' backyard. Karen Whitmore, president of the Willow Creek Homeowners Association, wiped sweat from her brow and raised the hammer again. The pool that had been the source of 18 months of violations, fines, and legal threats was finally meeting its end. "Ma'am, you can't just destroy someone else's property." Officer Martins called from the gate, but Karen was already mid-swing. "Watch me," she grunted, delivering another crushing blow to the pool's edge. "This is about property values, officer. This is about the integrity of our community." The pool had started as a beautiful addition to the Henderson property, until they'd let it turn into a green, mosquito-breeding swamp. Karen had issued citation after citation, each one ignored. The homeowners had fled to their daughter's house in Phoenix 6 months ago, leaving their foreclosed property and its festering pool behind. "Karen, please." Her neighbor Janet rushed through the gate, still in her grocery store uniform. "The bank owns this property now. You're going to get arrested." "The bank hasn't responded to a single one of my calls," Karen snapped, pausing to catch her breath. At 53, she wasn't built for demolition work, but desperation had given her strength she didn't know she possessed. Do you know what happens to property values when every house on the street has a view of this toxic waste dump? Officer Martinez was speaking rapidly into his radio. Karen knew she had minutes before backup arrived. She'd planned this moment for weeks, ever since she'd discovered the loophole in the HOA emergency powers clause. If a property posed an immediate health hazard to the community, the association president could take necessary corrective action. The health department already cleared it, Janet pleaded. They drained it last month. Drained, not cleaned, Karen corrected, pointing to the algae-stained walls and debris-filled shallow end. Rats nest in there, at night. Mrs. Chen saw one the size of a small dog. The sledgehammer felt heavier with each swing, but Karen's determination only grew stronger. She'd spent 3 years building this community from a collection of houses into a proper neighborhood. Perfect lawns, matching mailboxes, property values that had increased 30% under her leadership. She wouldn't let one abandoned eyesore destroy everything she'd worked for. "Ma'am, I'm going to need you to put down the hammer," Officer Martinez said, his hand moving to his belt. Karen paused, surveying her work. She'd managed to crack the pool's rim in several places and chip away a significant portion of the shallow end. It wasn't demolished, but it was definitely destroyed. "Fine," she said, dropping the sledgehammer with a metallic clang. "I think I've made my point." As the handcuffs clicked around her wrists, Karen caught sight of 3 neighbors watching from their windows. Their expressions weren't the grateful appreciation she'd expected. Instead, she saw something that chilled her more than the cool metal against her skin: fear. 6 months later, Karen stood in line at the hardware store, clutching a list that had nothing to do with community improvement projects. Garden hose, fertilizer, tomato cages. She read to herself, still getting used to the idea of shopping for her own backyard instead of patrolling everyone else's. "Karen?" The voice behind her was tentative. "Karen Whitmore." She turned to find Janet holding a basket full of painting supplies, looking as surprised as Karen felt. They'd barely spoken since the pool incident, despite living 3 houses apart. "Janet." Karen nodded stiffly. "How are you?" "Good. I'm painting my kitchen. Finally doing that renovation I kept talking about." Janet shifted her weight awkwardly. "I heard about your community service at the food bank. That's nice." "Court mandated," Karen said honestly. "Though I've been staying on after my hours are done. Turns out I'm good at organizing things when people actually want my help." They stood in uncomfortable silence until Janet spoke again. "The new HOA president. He's not working out so well." Despite herself, Karen felt a spark of interest. "Oh, he hasn't issued a single violation in 6 months. Mrs. Chen's front yard looks like a jungle. The Patels painted their house bright yellow, and someone on Maple Street has started raising chickens." Janet paused. "Property values are actually going up." Karen felt her carefully constructed new perspective wobble. "Up? Turns out people like living in a neighborhood where they can express themselves without getting fined." Janet's voice was gentle, but the words stung. "The realtor said buyers are specifically asking about our HOA policies now. They want to make sure we're not too restrictive." The hardware store clerk called next, and Karen stepped forward, her mind spinning. Everything she believed about community management, property values, and neighborhood standards was apparently wrong. The people of Willow Creek were thriving without her iron fist. "Karen," Janet called as Karen gathered her purchases. Would you like to come over for coffee sometime? I mean, if you want to." The invitation was tentative, fragile. Karen recognized it as an olive branch, maybe the only one she'd get. "I'd like that," Karen said, and meant it. That evening, Karen sat on her back porch, watching her husband tend to their vegetable garden. Dave had taken up gardening during her legal troubles, claiming he needed something peaceful to focus on. The tomatoes were thriving under his gentle care. No citations, no mandatory improvement schedules, just patience and attention. "Dave," Karen said suddenly, "I need to ask you something, and I need you to be honest." He looked up from where he was staking bean plants. "Okay. When did I stop being the woman you married?" Dave was quiet for so long that Karen thought he wouldn't answer. Finally, he wiped his hands on his jeans and sat beside her on the porch swing. "You didn't stop being her," he said carefully. "You just buried her under all that fear. Fear. Fear that our life wasn't good enough. Fear that other people's choices somehow diminished what we'd built together. Fear that if you weren't controlling everything, everything would fall apart." Karen felt tears she'd been holding back for months finally spill over. "I just wanted us to have the perfect life." "Karen," Dave said, taking her hand, "we already had a pretty good life. You just couldn't see it anymore." As they sat together in the gathering dusk, Karen noticed things she'd been too busy to see during her HOA reign. The way the different colored houses on their street created an interesting mosaic. How the sound of the Patel's children playing in their yard made the neighborhood feel alive. How Mrs. Chen's wildflower garden attracted butterflies that danced between the houses. Her phone buzzed with a text from Mitchell. "Community service supervisor says you're employee of the month at the food bank. Dad told me you're thinking about applying for the volunteer coordinator position." Karen smiled, typing back, "It's nice to be somewhere people actually want my organizational skills." But as she hit send, Karen's eyes drifted toward the street, where she'd once patrolled with her citation book and measuring tape. The new HOO president's house had a Halloween decoration still up in December, and despite everything she'd learned, despite 6 months of therapy and community service and personal growth, she felt her fingers itch for a violation notice. Old habits, Karen realized, died hard. The question was, how far had she really come? And what would happen the next time her community needed someone to take charge? Karen's court-appointed anger management class met in the basement of Street Mary's Community Center, in a circle of mismatched folding chairs that would have violated at least 6 HOA furniture guidelines. She sat between a road rage truck driver named Big Jim and a woman who'd thrown a microwave at her cheating boyfriend, trying to convince herself this was all temporary. "Karen, would you like to share what brought you here?" Dr. Reyes, the therapist, had kind eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses, but Karen had learned not to trust that kindness. "Property destruction," Karen said flatly, "though I prefer to call it community improvement." Big Jim snorted. "Lady, you sound like my ex-wife. Everything was everyone else's fault." "It's not the same thing," Karen snapped. "I was protecting property values for an entire neighborhood. These people have investments." "And you had a sledgehammer," interrupted Microwave Woman. "Honey, I used to justify everything too. My boyfriend was cheating, so throwing kitchen appliances made perfect sense. Until I realized the problem wasn't him. It was me thinking I could control other people." Karen shifted uncomfortably. "It's not about control. It's about standards." Dr. Reyes leaned forward. "Tell me about the first time you felt like you needed to fix something in your neighborhood." The memory came flooding back. Moving into Willow Creek 5 years ago, pregnant with hope about their new home, only to discover the house next door had a rusted car on blocks in the driveway and 3 different shades of beige paint peeling off the siding. She'd introduced herself to the neighbors with a casserole and a gentle suggestion about the car. They told her to mind her own business. "I just wanted things to be nice," Karen said, her voice smaller than she'd intended. "When Dave and I bought our house, it was supposed to be our forever home. We'd worked so hard to afford that neighborhood. And then," Dr. Reyes prompted, "and then I realized nobody else cared as much as I did." The words tumbled out faster now. Lawn ornaments that looked like garage sale rejects. Halloween decorations still up at Easter. Dogs barking at all hours. I started going to city council meetings, researching property law, talking to realtors about what affects home values. "When did you decide to run for HOA president?" Karen laughed bitterly. "There wasn't an HOA. I created it. Went door to door, got the required signatures, filed the paperwork. It took me 8 months, but I did it." Big Jim was staring at her with something like awe. "You created your own neighborhood police force." "I created structure," Karen corrected. "Rules that protected everyone's investments. And it worked. Our property values increased 30% in 3 years." "At what cost?" Dr. Reyes asked gently. Karen thought about Dave's exhausted face in the jail visitation room, about neighbors who crossed the street to avoid her, about the fear in their eyes when she'd been arrested. She thought about Janet, who'd been her closest friend until Karen had issued her a violation for her daughter's chalk art on the sidewalk. "I don't know," she whispered. "I honestly don't know anymore." For the first time in months, Karen made it through an entire therapy session without arguing. As she walked to her car afterward, her phone buzzed with a text from Dave. "New HOA president elected tonight. Thought you should know." Karen sat in her car in the church parking lot, watching normal people go about their normal lives, and wondered who she'd become in her quest to make everything perfect. The worst part wasn't the legal trouble or the community service or even the public humiliation. The worst part was realizing she wasn't sure who Karen Whitmore was without an HOA to run.